To understand what happened that night, you have to understand one person, Joseph Castana. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some random intruder. He was someone Jessica knew very well. Too well. They had been together for years. On and off. They shared a child. And like many relationships that start young, it becomes complicated, messy, hard to fully walk away from. But what made Joseph different was controlled. At first, it didn't look extreme. Arguments, jealousy, checking her phone, wanting to know where she was. But over time, it escalated. He didn't just want to be in her life. He wanted to control it. If Jessica tried to leave, he followed. If she went to work, he showed up. If she talked to someone else, he found out. Sometimes before she even told him. There were reports of violence. Moments where arguments turned physical. Moments where fear replaced familiarity. And yet, like many people in situations like this, Jessica didn't just walk away overnight. Because leaving someone like Joseph isn't simple. Aurora, on the surface, it's the kind of place people move to for peace. Tree-lined streets, modest homes, neighbors who recognize each other's cars without thinking twice. In the daytime, it feels ordinary in the best way. Kids riding bikes, parents heading to work, the quiet rhythm of routine holding everything together. At night, it settles into something even calmer, predictable, safe. And on one of those quiet streets stood the Serrano home. Nothing about it would catch your attention if you passed by. No signs of trouble, no visible cracks. Just another family house, living another ordinary life. But inside, there was a story. At the center of it was Jessica Serrano, 22 years old. At that age, life is usually about momentum, figuring things out, making mistakes, trying again. And Jessica was doing exactly that. From the outside, she looked like anyone else rebuilding their life, working through challenges, holding on to hope, trying to create something stable out of everything she'd been through. But what people didn't see, how hard she was fighting for that stability. Living with her was her father, Jesus Serrano, a man who carried the quiet responsibility of holding the family together. He wasn't loud about it, didn't need to be. You could see it in the small things. Waiting up at night until everyone was home, checking the doors, then check them again, making sure the house felt secure, even when life outside of it wasn't. He was the kind of father who understood that safety isn't just about locks and walls. It's about presence. And he was always present. Also in the home was Jessica's twin sister, Mariana. Their lives had always been intertwined. Same childhood, same memories, same foundation. But adulthood had brought its own paths and its own weight. Mariana was a mother now. 2 young daughters filled the house with energy, laughter one moment, chaos the next. Toys are scattered across rooms. Cartoons are playing in the background. The kind of noise that turns a house into something alive. It wasn't a perfect home. No home ever is. There were stresses, responsibilities, unspoken worries that come with raising children, supporting each other, and trying to move forward in life. But it was real. It was close. It was family. And in a world where things don't always go as planned, that kind of closeness matters because it creates something people rely on, a sense of security. A belief that no matter what happens outside, inside these walls, you're safe. That belief shaped everything about the Serrano home. The late-night routines, the shared meals, the quiet moments after the kids had gone to sleep. It was a place where people could exhale, where the outside world didn't feel so overwhelming. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Safety can be an illusion, because sometimes the danger isn't outside the house. It's not a stranger. It's not something you can see coming. Sometimes, it's someone who already knows the door, already knows the layout, already knows the people inside. And in the case of the Serrano family, that sense of safety, the thing they trusted most, was already being watched, already being studied, already being broken, long before anyone realized it. To understand what happened inside that house, you have to understand one person, Joseph Castana. Because this story doesn't begin with gunshots. It begins long before that, in a relationship that, on the surface, looked familiar. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone who forced his way into Jessica's life overnight. He was already there. Someone she had a history with, memories with, a past that stretched back years. Jessica and Joseph had been together on and off. The kind of relationship that never fully breaks. Even when it should, they shared a child. And that alone creates a bond that's hard to separate cleanly. Because even when the relationship ends, the connection doesn't. At the beginning, nothing about it seemed extreme. Just two young people figuring things out. Arguments here and there. Disagreements about small things. Moments of tension that most people would dismiss as normal. But slowly, the tone changed. Not all at once. Not in a way that would immediately alarm anyone watching from the outside. It came in pieces. Subtle at first. Jealousy. Questions that felt a little too constant. Where are you? Who are you with? Why didn't you answer? At first, it can sound like concern. Like someone who just cares a little too much. Then it becomes something else. Checking her phone. Watching her movements. Showing up unannounced. Not asking, but expecting answers. And over time, the line between concern and control disappears completely. Because for Joseph, being in Jessica's life wasn't enough. He needed to own it if she tried to create distance. He closed it if she tried to move on. He inserted himself back in. If she went somewhere without him, he found out. Sometimes faster than she could explain it. That's what made it unsettling. It wasn't just persistence. It was awareness. Like he was always one step behind her, or one step ahead. And then it escalated again. Arguments became louder, more intense, less about solving anything, and more about dominance. There were moments where things turned physical, moments that cross a line you can't uncross, moments where fear entered a relationship and stayed there. And once fear becomes part of a relationship, everything changes. The tone, the decisions, the way you move through your own life. Because now it's not just about leaving. It's about what happens if you do. And that's where Jessica found herself, caught between wanting out and knowing that walking away wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be simple, wouldn't be safe. Because leaving someone like Joseph, it isn't just a decision. It's a risk of being followed, a risk of being watched, a risk of escalation. And like many people in situations like this, Jessica didn't just disappear overnight. She tried to manage it, to create distance slowly, to keep things calm enough, to avoid making it worse. But for someone like Joseph, distance doesn't feel like space. It feels like a loss. And loss feels like something that needs to be corrected. That's when control turns into obsession. And obsession, don't let go quietly. By the time things truly began to fall apart, this wasn't just a relationship anymore. It was a pattern, a cycle, one that had been building quietly long before anyone realized how far it would go. And the most dangerous part? From the outside, it still didn't look like something that would end in tragedy. But inside that dynamic, the pressure was building, the tension was growing, and the outcome, it was getting closer. By 2022, whatever this relationship had once been, it was gone. What remained was something heavier, something more dangerous. The shift didn't happen overnight. It never does. It built slowly, piece by piece, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. And by then, it was already too late. Joseph Castana wasn't just calling anymore. He wasn't just arguing. He wasn't just showing up unexpectedly. Now, he was watching, not in a distant, casual way, but up close, persistent, unsettling. He would appear outside the house, without warning, standing just far enough away to avoid confrontation, but close enough to be seen. Other times, he was closer, too close, peering through windows, checking for movement, looking for signs that Jessica was inside, or maybe looking for the right moment to approach. And then came something even more disturbing. Attempts to get inside, doors tested, windows examined, movement around the property at odd hours. The kind of activity that turns a home from a place of comfort into something tense, something watched, At that point, the family couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't a relationship issue. This wasn't just drama. This was a security problem, a real one. So they adapted. They reinforced parts of the house, secured entry points, made physical changes, not for convenience, but for protection. Think about what that means. A family modifying their own home, not to improve it, but to defend it. That's not normal. That's survival. Inside those walls, the atmosphere began to change. The same house that once felt warm and familiar now carried tension. A quiet awareness that something wasn't right. Doors were checked more often. Curtains stayed closed longer. Every unfamiliar sound meant something. And at the center of it all was Jesus Serrano, a father who didn't need a full explanation to understand what was happening. Because fear doesn't always need words. You can see it in the way someone moves. In this way, they pause before answering questions. In the way they look over their shoulder, even when nothing is there. He saw it in Jessica, and that was enough. So he stepped in. I tried to create distance, tried to put barriers between his daughter and the person causing that fear. But here's the reality in situations like this. By the time someone else steps in, the dynamic has already changed. Because for Joseph, this wasn't about a relationship anymore. It had become something else. Something more rigid, more obsessive, more dangerous. He no longer saw Jessica as someone with choices, with independence, with a life separate from him. He saw her as something tied to him, something that couldn't just leave, something that couldn't be taken away. And once that mindset sets in, everything shifts. Rejection isn't just rejection. It becomes a threat. Distance isn't just space. It becomes a loss. And loss feels like something that has to be corrected. That's the turning point. The moment where control becomes desperation, where persistence becomes intrusion, where presence becomes surveillance. And by 2022, that line had already been crossed. What makes this part of the story so unsettling? Are the warning signs visible? Clear, repeated. But like many cases like this, they didn't come all at once. They came in layers, gradually, almost quietly, until one day you look back and realize just how far things had gone. Because by now, Joseph wasn't just outside the home. He wasn't just watching from a distance. He was getting closer, more confident, more deliberate, and without anyone fully realizing it, the boundary between outside and inside, it was already beginning to disappear. And once that boundary is gone, there's nothing left to stop what comes next. October 30th, 2022. There's nothing about that date that stands out at first. No storm, no tension in the air, no sign that this night will be remembered for anything at all. Earlier that evening, life had felt normal. Jessica and her father, Jesus Serrano, had gone to a family gathering, the kind of night that blends into memory, conversations, laughter, familiar faces, a break from routine. For a few hours, everything felt steady, safe. There were no arguments, no sudden phone calls, no warnings, nothing that hinted at what was already unfolding behind the scenes. Sometime around 2 a.m., they head home. The streets of Aurora are quiet. Most homes are dark. The world feels asleep. They arrive, pull into the driveway, walk inside, and everything appears exactly as it should be. The house is still. No movement, no noise, no visible sign that anything is wrong. That's what makes this moment so unsettling. Because danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's already there. Jessica moves through the house the way she always has. Familiar steps, routine motions, nothing out of place. She heads to her room, closes the door. It starts to wind down. The kind of quiet moment you don't think twice about. But this time, something is different. She opens her closet, reaches in, and pauses. At first, it's subtle. Something feels off. Not wrong in an obvious way, just out of place. Then she sees it. A jacket, folded, but not the way she would leave it. Pants, not hers. Keys, resting where nothing should be. For a second, her mind tries to make sense of it. Maybe someone moved something. Maybe she forgot. Maybe. But then reality cuts through that hesitation. Sharp, immediate, unavoidable. She recognizes them. Instantly. They belong to Joseph Castana. And in that moment, everything changes. Because there's no reasonable explanation for why his belongings would be there. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the distance she had tried to create. Not after the boundaries that had been set. Which leaves only one possibility. He had been inside. Not earlier in the day. Not recently. But recently enough to leave those things behind. And if his belongings are there, then he was there. And if he was there, there's no guarantee he ever left. That realization hits all at once. Heavy, immediate, paralyzing. The room doesn't feel the same anymore. The house doesn't feel the same anymore. What was familiar just seconds ago, now I feel exposed. Because this isn't just a sign of intrusion. It's something deeper. It means someone crossed every boundary, every lock, every precaution. It means someone entered a space that was supposed to be protected and did it quietly, carefully, without being seen. And most terrifying of all, it means he could still be there, somewhere in the house, hidden, watching. The silence suddenly feels louder. Every small sound becomes sharper. Every shadow carries weight. Because now, this isn't just a home anymore. It's a place where someone has been waiting. And Jessica has just realized it. Too late to ignore. Too real to dismiss. At that moment, there's no question of what to do next. Only instinct. Only fear. Only one thought cutting through everything else. She's not alone in that house. And whatever happens next is already in motion. The moment Jessica realizes those clothes belong to Joseph Castana, instinct takes over. There's no time to second guess. No time to search the house. No time to hope she's wrong. She reaches for her phone and dials 911. Her voice at first is controlled, measured. She's trying to stay calm, trying to explain what she's seeing in a way that makes sense. But underneath that control, there's something else. Something you can't hide. Fear, not uncertainty, not confusion. Real fear. My ex-boyfriend, he's not supposed to be here. There's a pause, but his stuff is inside the house. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher listens carefully, trained to stay steady, to keep things moving, to extract information quickly. Questions come one after another. Clear, direct. Did you see him? Is anyone else in the house? Are you safe right now? Jessica answers as best as she can. But even as she speaks, her focus is shifting. Because now that she said it out loud, it feels more real. This isn't just suspicion anymore. This is happening. The dispatcher reassures her. Officers are on the way. Stay on the line. Stay somewhere safe. But safe doesn't feel real anymore. Not in that house. Not now. Jessica moves quickly, not running, not making noise. Every step is careful, deliberate. She heads for the bathroom, one of the only places she can lock herself in. The door closes, clicks shut, lights off. She presses herself against the door, holding it, as if her body alone can keep everything outside. The phone is still in her hand. The dispatcher is still talking. But Jessica isn't really listening anymore, because now every sound matters. The house, which once felt quiet, now feel alive. She hears something. At first, it's faint, easy to dismiss. But then, there is again, movement. Not outside, not distant, inside, somewhere in the house. Her breathing changes. Shorter, sharper. She tries to stay silent. But silence becomes harder the more she listens. A floorboard creaks. A subtle shift. The kind of sound you wouldn't notice on any other night. But now, it's everything. Because it confirms the one thing she didn't want to believe. He never left. The dispatcher's voice cuts in, trying to keep her grounded. Stay on the phone with me. Don't hang up. You're doing well. But Jessica is no longer thinking about instructions. She's listening, waiting, trying to understand where he is, how close he is. And then something changes. A presence, not a sound, not movement, but something closer. She looks up, slowly, carefully, And that's when she sees it. A shadow, faint, distorted, just beyond the bathroom window. For a split second, her mind tries to reject it. But deep down, she already knows. It's him, Joseph. He's not searching the house anymore. He's searching for her. And somehow, he's already found where she is. The distance between them has collapsed. The walls that once separated inside from outside. It doesn't matter anymore. Because now, there's nothing left between them. Just a thin barrier, a locked door, and a moment that's about to break. Jessica doesn't move. She can't. Every instinct is telling her the same thing. Stay quiet. Stay still. Don't make a sound. But fear doesn't stay contained. It builds. It tightens. It presses in from every direction. And outside that door, so does he. Whatever happens next is no longer preventable, because this call for help came just moments too late. Outside the bathroom door, there is no more doubt, no more confusion, no more maybe, only certainty. Joseph Castana is there. At first, it's subtle, a shift in the air, a presence moving through the house with intention, not random, not searching blindly, focused. Then the bathroom window frame rattles, lightly at first, then again, harder. He's testing it, measuring it, learning its weak points. Jessica freezes. Every instinct screams at her to stay still, to stay quiet, to disappear inside herself. She presses her body against the bathroom door, not just locking it, holding it, as if pressure alone can keep reality from breaking through. Her breathing becomes shallow, controlled, forced, because any sound might give her away. Outside the door, the movements continue. A shift, a pause, then another attempt. Now the door itself, a handle twisting, slow, deliberate, testing resistance. Then a harder push. The frame shakes slightly. The house itself feels like it's reacting. Jessica tightens her grip. Her entire body becomes part of the lock. There is no backup plan, no escape route, only endurance. Seconds stretch, then minutes. But time no longer feels linear. It feels suspended, like the world has narrowed to the single point, a locked door between life and something unthinkable. And then it happens, a sound that doesn't belong in a house like this. Gunfire, loud, sharp, violent. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside the house, close enough that the walls seem to absorb it. Once, then again, then again. Each shot echoes differently, each one heavier than the last. And in that instant, everything changes, because this is no longer a break-in, no longer a confrontation, no longer something that can be interrupted. This is an execution unfolding in real time. Jessica doesn't move. She can't. Her body refuses to respond the way her mind is screaming at it to, because now she understands what those sounds mean. Somewhere in the house, her family is there. Jesus Serrano is there. Her sister is there. The children are there. The life she walked through hours earlier is there. And now it is under attack. But she is trapped behind a locked bathroom door, helpless, pinned in place by fear, so heavy it feels physical. Every instinct is now divided. Half of her wants to move, to run, to help, to do something, anything, but the other half knows the truth. Moving means exposure. Exposure means discovery. Discovery means death. So she stays, frozen, listening. Each sound outside the room becomes a signal. Footsteps, movement, a door opening somewhere deeper in the house. Then silence again. The silence is worse than the noise, because silence means uncertainty. And uncertainty means imagination fills the gaps. Her mind begins to build images she cannot stop, rooms she cannot see, people she cannot reach, moments she cannot interrupt. And through it all, she remains pressed against the door, breathing unevenly, counting seconds that don't feel like seconds anymore. The house she grew up in, the place that once meant safety, has become something unrecognizable. It no longer feels like a home. It feels like a container for something unfolding too fast to understand. And inside that container, she is the only thing still separated from it. The gunshots stop. But the silence that follows is not peace. It is absent, heavy, final, unclear, and Jessica is still there, still listening, still waiting, still alive, inside a moment that will never feel like it has ended. The silence after the gunfire doesn't last. Not really, because silence in a situation like this is never peace. It's a transition. Inside the house, everything is already shifted. The balance of control that once belonged to fear is beginning to break. Outside the bathroom, footsteps stop. Then the door handle moves again. But this time, it doesn't feel like searching. It feels like certainty. A final push. A final decision. And then, the door gives way. It doesn't burst open dramatically. It doesn't explode inward. It simply yields. Like something that was never meant to hold forever. And there he is, Joseph Castana, standing in the doorway, close enough now that there is no misunderstanding, no doubt, no chance of escape. Gun in his hand, arm steady, breathing controlled. And Jessica sees him fully now, not as a shadow, not as a presence, not as fear in her imagination, but as reality, face to face. Everything narrows. The room, the air, the moment. There is no negotiation in his posture, no hesitation in his eyes, only intent, finality. Jessica doesn't move. There is nowhere to go, no angle left, no time left. This is the point where every prior second leads, every warning, every fear, every ignored boundary. It all collapses into the single frame. He raises the weapon, slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that tells her this is not panic. This is a decision. And then the trigger is pulled. A sound should follow. A violent break in reality. A confirmation of what fear has been building toward. But instead, there is nothing, just a small mechanical click. No discharge, no impact, no explosion of consequence. Only silence. For a fraction of a second, the world doesn't react, as if it's confusing, as if it needs to recalculate what just happened. Joseph pauses, just slightly, not long enough to fully register doubt, but long enough for everything to shift, because in that instant, the certainty he was standing on disappears. The weapon that was supposed to end everything doesn't, and suddenly, he is no longer in control of the moment. Jessica is still frozen, but something inside the situation has changed, something irreversible, because fear only holds power when it feels inevitable, and inevitability just broke. Behind him, the house is no longer silent in the same way. It is no longer empty in the same way. It is no longer alone. Outside this room, the chain of events he thought he controlled has started to unravel. And in this one suspended moment, everything that follows is no longer guaranteed. Not for him, not for her, not for anyone still inside that house. Because when a weapon fails to do what it was meant to do, the story doesn't end. It changes direction. There is a moment in every violent encounter where the body decides faster than the mind can catch up. This is that moment. After the trigger clicks uselessly, there's a fraction of hesitation. Small, almost invisible, but it's enough. Sirens, still far away, but approaching, growing, becoming real. For the first time since the bathroom, the situation begins to shift away from isolation, away from silence, away from control. Joseph hears it too, and for a brief moment, he slows, not stopping, not surrendering, just recalculating. Because now there's a third force entering this moment. Something outside both of them. Something neither of them controls anymore. Jessica keeps running. Her voice is still breaking through the night, but now it's mixed with the sound of help approaching. Behind her, he is still there, still following, still present. And in that stretch of street, something fragile happens. Something small, something critical. A distance opens. Not enough to feel safe, but enough to change the outcome. Jessica reaches the edge of visibility from a house, where neighbors are now fully reacting, where phones are out, where reality is no longer private. And that moment becomes the reason she is still alive, not because danger disappeared, but because attention arrived, because darkness cannot sustain itself once it is fully seen. Joseph does not stop completely, but he hesitates, just long enough for the world around him to begin closing in, and then he turns back, not defeated, not resolved, but interrupted. He disappears back toward the house as sirens close in, leaving behind a street that is now filled with voices, confusion, and the beginning of emergency response. Jessica collapses into the moment she has been running toward, without knowing it. Help is finally real. Hands reach her. Voices surround her. The nightmare is no longer isolated inside one home. But even as she is pulled away from the scene, even as the chaos becomes structured, controlled, and medical, one question remains suspended in the air, heavy, unanswered, because what just happened was not random. It was not sudden. It was not unplanned. It was the end of something that had been building for a long time. So the question now is no longer what happened that night. It is this: if Joseph was willing to follow her into the street, into the open, into a world that was waking up, then what was he prepared to do before anything went wrong? And how far was he willing to go? If nothing had stopped him at all, that question doesn't get answered here, because the story is not finished. It has only changed shape. Jessica is running, but it doesn't feel like running anymore. It feels like survival stripped down to instinct. Jessica Serrano is barefoot on cold pavement in the middle of the night in Aurora. Her feet hit the ground unevenly, sharp pain flaring with every step, but she doesn't register it fully. Her body has stopped prioritizing pain. It has one instruction left: keep moving. Her breath comes in broken pieces. Inhale, stutter, exhale, repeat. Her lungs feel too small for the amount of fear inside her. Behind her, the night answers with movement. Footsteps, not random, not hesitant, focused. Joseph Castana is chasing her, and he is not losing ground. Jessica doesn't look back at first. Looking back slows people down. Looking back turns fear into confirmation. So she keeps her eyes forward and runs harder. But the sound doesn't fade. It gets closer, faster than it should. Joseph moves through the neighborhood like he already knows it. Fences don't stop him. Corners don't confuse him. Distance doesn't discourage him. It's not a chase anymore. It's pursuit. Jessica turns a corner too sharply and nearly slips. Her body corrects instinctively. She pushes forward again. And then it happens. A sudden force from behind. A grip, strong, immediate, final. She's pulled backward into him. Her momentum stops violently. The world compresses into one point of contact. Her mind struggles to process what just changed. She was running. Now she isn't. For a moment, everything freezes. No screaming, no movement, just breath and proximity. Too close. She can feel him, hear him, and then his voice. Low, controlled, but heavy with something darker underneath. You should have never found my pants. The words don't make sense at first. Not fully, not emotionally. Then they do, because it's not about clothing. It's not about objects. It's about presence, about discovery, about being seen when he believed he shouldn't have been. It's a confession hiding inside anger. And it changes everything. Because now it's clear this was never random, never spontaneous, never a sudden eruption of violence. This was access, planning, waiting. He wasn't just in the house. He had been inside it long enough to understand it, to move through it unseen, to choose when to act. Jessica reacts, not strategically, not thoughtfully, instinctively. She fights, twists, pushes, anything to break contact. Her body is small compared to the force holding her, but survival doesn't negotiate size. It only pushes back, and for a moment, it works. She breaks free, stumbles forward, catches herself, and runs again. This time, her breathing is louder, less controlled, more desperate. But something is different now. The dynamic has shifted, because the night is no longer silent. In the distance, a new sound cuts through everything. Sirens, sharp, growing, unmistakable, not imagined, not distant, real, approaching. For the first time since the chase began, something else enters the equation. something neither of them controls. Joseph hears it too, and he pauses, just for a fraction of a second, but it's enough. The pursuit changes shape instantly. His focus shifts, his posture changes, the certainty in his movement fractures, because now there are witnesses, because now there's a response, because now the world is no longer empty. Jessica keeps moving, but the distance between them begins to matter again, not because she is faster, but because time is no longer as alone. The sirens grow louder, closer, surrounding the space between chaos and control. And then, something unexpected happens. Joseph releases her. Not gently, not kindly, but decisively. The grip is gone. Jessica stumbles forward, nearly collapsing under the sudden absence of force. She turns instinctively, but he is already moving away. Not toward her, not continuing the chase. Away, back into darkness, back toward the house, back toward whatever remains unfinished behind him. The chase ends without resolution, not because it is over, but because it is interrupted. And that is what makes it worse. Because endings imply closure. This did not end. It broke. Jessica is now surrounded by approaching emergency lights, voices, movement, reality returning in fragments. But nothing about her experience has been processed yet. She is still alive, still standing, still aware that something followed her into the night, and then chose to stop. And that creates a question heavier than fear itself. Why stop now? What changes when someone is willing to chase you through darkness, decides not to finish it? And what does that say about what he already did inside that house, before anyone ever arrived? That answer doesn't come here. It waits, somewhere behind the sirens, somewhere inside the silence he left behind, and it's still unfolding. The first officers don't fully understand what they're walking into. They only know there's been a shooting, multiple victims, a chaotic 911 call, a survivor outside. But nothing prepares them for the reality waiting inside the home in Aurora. Outside, Jessica Serrano is barely standing. She is shaking uncontrollably. Her body keeps trying to explain what her mind cannot organize into words. Her mouth opens. Nothing coherent comes out. Just fragments. Just panic. Just disbelief trying and failing to become language. Officers try to stabilize her, ask questions, slow her breathing, anchor her to the present. But she is not fully in the present anymore. She is still inside the house, still in the hallway, still seeing what she saw seconds ago. And then they go in. The front door is open, not broken dramatically, not forced in a cinematic explosion, just open, as if the house itself is finished resisting. Inside, the silence is immediate, heavy, wrong. Officers move carefully through the entryway. Every step is measured. Every corner was treated as dangerous. But even without confirmation, they already know. The tone of the space tells them before the evidence does. Then they reach the first room and stop. No announcement is needed. No radio call is necessary. The body language says it all. This is not a developing situation anymore. This is the aftermath. Room by room, they move through the home. Each space reveals what the last one confirmed. Each discovery removes any remaining uncertainty. The scene becomes a sequence of irreversible confirmations. Mariana Serrano, Jesus Serrano, Mariana's partner, a family friend on the property. 4 lives, gone, inside a place that hours earlier had been just another home. There is no dramatic chaos now. No movement, no struggle, only stillness. The kind of stillness that feels heavier than sound. Investigators begin to map the scene instinctively. Positions, rooms, entry points, trajectories. But even in professional motion, there is hesitation, because training does not remove human response. And scenes like this leave impressions that don't fit neatly into procedure. Then, a detail begins to stand out, something that shifts the entire emotional way of the case. 2 young children, found inside the house, alive, unharmed. The contrast is immediate and disorienting. The same environment, the same moment, different outcomes. That realization settles into investigators slowly. And then all at once, this was not random chaos. not uncontrolled violence, not indiscriminate rage. This was a selection. The presence of intent becomes unavoidable, because whoever did this did not act without distinction. They made choices, and that changes everything about how the case is understood, because now, investigators are no longer looking at a sudden tragedy. They are looking at decision-making under violence, pattern under panic, structure under horror. Outside the home, Jessica is still trying to speak, still trying to answer questions she doesn't yet have the capacity to process, still trapped between what she survived and what she understands. And inside the house, the investigation is only beginning to define what happened. But one conclusion forms early, even before all evidence is fully processed. The suspect did not move blindly. He moved deliberately. He chose targets. He chose outcomes. And he chose not to harm everyone in the house. That final detail, the children surviving, does not bring comfort. It brings something more unsettling. It raises a question no one wants to ask out loud. Why them? Why not them? And what determined the difference? Because in this house, survival, it was not random. It was assigned, and the person who assigned it is still out there somewhere in the aftermath of the night. At first, the question is straightforward. Simple, even, where is he? But in true crime investigations, simple questions rarely stay simple for long, because once the scene begins to speak, it changes the shape of everything that follows. Inside the cordoned-off home in Aurora, the early focus is containment, evidence preservation, victim identification, suspect location. But underneath the procedural language, a deeper shift is happening, because detectives are no longer just responding to a crime. They are trying to understand a system of events that unfolded with intent. The immediate suspect is Joseph Castana, but knowing who he is doesn't answer the real questions. It only opens them. How did this happen inside a locked home? How did the situation escalate so quickly? And why did it begin at that exact moment? Investigators begin reconstructing the night in fragments, not as a story yet, but as disconnected points in time. The 911 call comes first, a timestamp, a voice, a woman reporting something already wrong. Then the discovery inside the house, the hidden clothing, the realization that someone had been inside long before the violence began. That detail alone shifts the case, because it removes randomness from the equation. Someone didn't arrive, someone returned, or never fully left. Next comes a sequence of movement, room by room, location by location, victim by victim. Patterns begin to emerge. Not chaos, not confusion, but directional behavior. Officers start mapping. Entry points, interior access routes, lines of movement through the home, where each confrontation likely occurred. And slowly, the structure becomes visible. This wasn't a single eruption of violence. It was a progression, each action leading into the next, each moment building on the previous one. Each decision narrows outcomes. Then comes the deeper realization, the one that changes the tone of the entire investigation. This wasn't just about presence. It was about preparation. Because nothing about the timeline suggests improvisation. Everything suggests familiarity. Investigators begin reviewing prior reports, incidents, warnings, behavior patterns, previous disturbances involving Jessica Serrano and the suspect, and a pattern emerges. Not one event, not one escalation, but a long chain of proximity. He had been inside the orbit of that home before, repeatedly, over time. That realization reframes everything, because now the house is no longer just a location. It becomes a reference point in a longer behavioral pattern. Detectives begin to ask a more difficult question. Not what happened that night, but what led him to believe that night was possible. The answer starts forming in the background of the investigation. Reports of prior stalking behavior, repeated attempt to access or observe the property, unwanted presence near the home, escalating boundary violations. Not all of it had been fully understood at the time. Not all of it had been treated as part of a single trajectory. But now, it connects, and with each connection, the picture sharpens. Joseph didn't appear suddenly. He built toward access, built toward familiarity, built toward timing. He learned routines. He observed patterns. He identified when the house was most vulnerable, and then he waited, not in urgency, but in patience, because what investigators are now seeing is not a spontaneous act. It is a calculated convergence of opportunity and intent. The night itself becomes less important than the preparation leading up to it, because the preparation explains what chaos alone cannot. Even the placement of items inside the home begins to matter. The clothing found earlier, the positioning, the timing of discovery, all of it suggests one disturbing conclusion. He had been inside the space long enough to control information the family didn't know was missing, and that realization changes the emotional weight of the entire investigation, because now it is no longer just about a violent intrusion. It is about prolonged observation turning into action, and that leads detectives back to the most important unanswered question, not where he is, not how he got in, but why did he believe he could do it at all? And that answer is still waiting somewhere beyond the night, because the deeper investigators dig into the timeline, the more it becomes clear. This case did not begin on October 30th. It only ended there. In the hours after the violence, the investigation begins to shift again. What started as a search for a suspect has become something more layered, something psychological, because as detectives sit with Jessica Serrano, they are no longer only reconstructing a crime scene. They are reconstructing a relationship, and what emerges is not random conflict. It is a pattern. At first, it sounds familiar to investigators. Too familiar. The kind of pattern that shows up in case files long before it becomes visible in headlines. Control, escalation, possession. The suspect, Joseph Castana, didn't begin at violence. He began at persistence, at proximity, at refusal. Jessica describes it in fragments, because memory under trauma rarely arrives in order. But the pattern becomes clear anyway. He didn't accept the distance. He didn't accept no. And more importantly, he didn't accept absence. At first, it was present without permission, showing up where he wasn't invited, appearing at places she didn't expect to see him. Small intrusions that could be dismissed individually, but together they formed something harder to ignore. Then came surveillance behaviors, knowing where she had been without being told, arriving after her movements had already changed, intervening in spaces that should have been private. To outside observers, these moments might have looked disconnected, but in context, they begin to form a system, a map of observation, a pattern of tracking. Then the digital layer emerges, fake accounts, false identities, messages that weren't what they seemed, people who weren't real, conversations designed to gather information while hiding intent, not direct confrontation, indirect access, not asking for control, building conditions where control already exists, and over time, something more damaging than physical presence takes shape. Isolation. Jessica describes how interactions became complicated by interference, how communication felt monitored, how relationships outside of him became harder to maintain. When emotional space slowly narrowed, this is where investigators pause, because this is no longer just behavioral conflict. This is structured coercion. The pattern is not loud. It is incremental, each step small enough to rationalize on its own, but together, they form a tightening perimeter. Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it builds by reducing options, reducing trust, reducing distance, until the person inside it no longer feels fully free to move. And in this case, that progression becomes critical, because it reframes everything that followed. When control is challenged repeatedly and successfully resisted, it often escalates, not immediately, not predictably, but decisively, and investigators begin to see that shift in the timeline. The increase in intensity, the inability to disengage, the growing fixation on presence and proximity. Jessica's attempts to separate were not met with acceptance. They were met with reentry, reappearance, reassertion, and eventually with pressure that could no longer remain indirect. This is where the emotional logic of the suspect becomes important, not to justify, but to understand the trajectory, because escalation in these cases rarely appears without a perceived loss. And here, that perceived loss was separation, distance, autonomy. What investigators begin to recognize is that Joseph did not interpret separation as an ending. He interpreted it as resistance, something to overcome, something to reverse. And when that reversal did not happen, the behavior escalated beyond containment. Control, once threatened, often intensifies before it breaks, not because it is stronger, but because it is collapsing inward. And that collapse is what investigators now believe they're seeing in the final stage of the timeline. The night of the attack was not the beginning of instability. It was the end point of a pattern that had already been unfolding for a long time, a pattern that moved from attention to interference, to intrusion, to presence, to escalation, and finally, to irreversible violence. What makes this realization difficult for investigators is not just the brutality of the outcome, it is the predictability of the structure. Because once the pattern is visible, it becomes clear how many points along the way could have changed it. But hindsight is not prevention, and prevention, in this case, arrived too late. As the investigation continues, one conclusion becomes increasingly unavoidable. This was not about a single moment of rage. It was about sustained control that could no longer maintain itself through nonviolence. And when that system failed, everything inside its orbit collapsed with it. But even with this understanding forming, one question remains unanswered, the one that sits beneath every interview, every report, every reconstructed timeline. What happens when control is no longer possible, but desire to maintain it still exists? The answer to that question is what investigators are still trying to fully understand. And it is what will define everything that comes next in the case. The moment Joseph disappears, the case stops being just an investigation. It becomes a manhunt. Joseph Castana is no longer inside the frame of a known location, no confirmed sighting, no reliable direction of travel, no immediate trail to follow. What remains is absence, and absence, in cases like this, is dangerous because it means movement without visibility. Outside the home in Aurora, the scene is still active. Officers, evidence teams, perimeter control, but the focus is already shifted outward. The question is no longer what happened inside. It is where he went after. The first hours are critical. Canine units are deployed. Scent tracking begins from the last confirmed point of contact. The house becomes a reference anchor. Every movement outside it is reconstructed in reverse. Surveillance footage from surrounding streets is pulled rapidly, hours compressed into minutes of review. Frames examined for motion that don't belong. Figures crossing yards. Cars are leaving at unusual times. Any trace of direction. But the problem is immediate. The timeline is fragmented. Too many gaps. Too many unknowns. Then, investigators begin interviewing those closest to him. Family, acquaintances, people who may have seen him after the incident. And this is where the case changes again. Because the search for Joseph expands beyond geography. It expands into relationships. It becomes clear that he did not move through the aftermath alone. He made contact. He reached out. He depended on others, not strangers, family. And that realization shifts the investigation into a more complicated space. Because now it is not only about locating a suspect. It is about understanding who assisted him after the fact, even indirectly, even unknowingly. At first, responses are cautious, vague, hesitant. People are trying to separate themselves from something they don't fully want to understand. But pressure builds, not through accusation alone, but through evidence, timelines, and inconsistencies. And slowly, pieces begin to surface. A pickup, a brief stop, a phone call was made in urgency, a conversation that doesn't match earlier statements. Not all assistance is intentional. Not all involvement is direct. But movement requires resources. And Joseph had none of his own left in the immediate aftermath. What emerges is a network of proximity. People connected to him by family ties, obligation, confusion, or fear. And within that network, decisions were made. Some are active, some passive. Some were made without understanding the full picture. But all of them contribute to motion. And motion is what investigators are trying to reconstruct. Meanwhile, Joseph's behavior in those first hours becomes clearer through fragmented accounts. He is not calm. He is not strategic. He is not in control. He is panicked, disoriented, reacting to reality that has already surpassed him. Witnesses and contacts describe brief, fractured communication. I messed up. I don't know what I did. I need to go. But investigators do not interpret these as confusion alone, because confusion does not explain structure. And what happened inside the house was structured. There is a distinction they recognize immediately. A person can be emotionally overwhelmed and still be aware of consequences. And Joseph's actions after the incident show awareness of consequence, even in panic. He avoids visibility. He avoids predictable routes. He avoids areas that are being monitored. That is not randomness. That is evasion. And yet, despite that evasion, the net is tightening, because every contact leaves a trace. Every call leaves a record. Every movement creates a gap that can be measured. Investigators begin mapping those gaps, not just where he was seen, but where he was not seen, and why. And then a critical realization forms. He is not traveling alone. He is being moved, or assisted, or both. This introduces a new layer to the case, because now the investigation is not only about a fugitive. It is about a support structure forming around a fugitive in real time. And that support structure is unstable, because the people involved are not united by intent. They are united by proximity, fear, confusion, loyalty, and shock. As pressure increases, inconsistencies begin to surface in statements. Details that shift under repeated questioning, timelines that do not align, accounts that change when confronted with new information, and slowly, the story begins to fracture, not into one narrative, but into multiple partial truths. Investigators begin isolating the most critical pattern. Joseph is not being hidden effectively. He is moving through uncertainty, from place to place, from contact to contact. Each one is temporary. Each one is unstable. And that instability becomes key, because fugitives under panic are predictable in one way. They look for familiarity, even when familiarity is no longer safe. Family members who speak to investigators describe something consistent. He was not calm. He was not composed. He was repeating himself. He was distressed. But they also describe something else, something more important. He knew what had happened, even if he struggled to articulate it. Even if he tried to distance himself from it verbally, even if he avoided naming it directly, because awareness is not the same as acceptance, and avoidance is not the same as ignorance. What investigators conclude is simple, but critical. He was not confused about the outcome. He was overwhelmed by it. And that distinction drives the urgency of the manhunt, because someone in that state is unpredictable, not in intent, but in direction. As the hours continue, law enforcement begins expanding coordination across jurisdictions. Patterns are shared, tips are verified, leads are prioritized, and the net tightens further, not through a single breakthrough, but through accumulation. Every small inconsistency becomes a thread. Every contact becomes a node. Every movement becomes part of a map. And somewhere inside that map, Joseph is still moving, still reacting, still trying to outrun a reality that has already caught up to him in every other way. But investigators now understand something important. He is not invisible. He is just uncontained. And that is exactly what makes the next stage of the manhunt inevitable. The search for Joseph Castana begins to stretch into something heavier than a local investigation. Days turn into weeks. And with each passing day, one possibility grows louder in the minds of investigators. He didn't just disappear. He escaped the system's immediate reach. Inside Aurora, pressure builds on law enforcement teams. Patrols slow. Leads dry up. Surveillance footage stops producing anything useful. The case risks becoming what investigators fear most, a fading trail. But then something subtle shifts the direction of the entire investigation. Not a witness, not a camera, not a confession, a pattern. The calls that changed everything. Investigators begin reviewing communication, records tied to Joseph's known contacts. What they find is not random. It is structured, repeated international calls, consistent destinations, connections reaching beyond state lines, beyond the country entirely. At first, It looks like nothing more than panic behavior. A suspect is trying to reach family, trying to escape pressure, trying to find safety in familiarity. But when analysts map the timing of the calls against confirmed sightings, a clearer picture begins to form. The calls are not just emotional. They are directional. They trace movement. They suggest coordination. They suggest refuge. And that changes everything. Because now, investigators are no longer just searching locally. They are tracking a person potentially moving across borders. The shift to Mexico. The investigation expands into cross-border coordination. Law enforcement agencies begin working with international partners, sharing identity profile, photographs, and behavioral patterns. The focus narrows to one key region, Mexico, because several calls originate from family-linked contacts there. And more importantly, because people close to Joseph have tied there. It is not a guess anymore. It is a lead, a strong one, a fugitive on the move. Intelligence begins to surface in fragments. Unconfirmed sightings, descriptions that matches build, reports of a man moving between small communities, never staying long, never settling. He is no longer operating with any sense of stability. He is drifting from relative to relative, from shelter to uncertainty, from temporary safety to the next unknown step. And with each move, something becomes increasingly clear. He is running out of places where he is welcome. Family members begin to distance themselves. Some refuse contact. Some cooperate with authorities quietly. Others are already afraid of what association means. Because by now, the story is no longer private. It is global enough to carry consequences. The recognition moment. Then comes a turning point. Not from law enforcement, but from an ordinary person. Someone outside the investigation. Someone not trained for this. Just someone who sees him. A man matching the description of Joseph is noticed in a public space. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. Just recognition. A face that has been circulated enough times to become unforgettable. And that person makes a decision that ends the uncertainty. They call it in. The final location. That single call triggers a coordinated response. Local authorities move quickly. Verification begins. Surveillance is confirmed. And within hours, the search narrows to a precise location. Joseph is no longer an unknown variable. He is physically placed, tracked, contained within reach. He has been moving between family contacts, staying briefly, leaving quickly, always reacting, never establishing control. The man once described as elusive is now simply exposed by repetition. Too many sightings, too many inconsistencies, too many people recognize what he looks like. The capture begins. When law enforcement closes in, there is no dramatic resistance. No confrontation defines a moment, just inevitability. He is taken into custody, alive, unarmed, after weeks of movement that left behind fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. And for investigators, the emotional weight of the arrest is complex, because capturing him does not undo what happened inside that house. It only stops the uncertainty of where he is now, what the breakthrough really meant. This was not a single moment of brilliance in the investigation. It was an accumulation, communication records, cross-border coordination, family interviews, public awareness, and finally, one person deciding to act. And that is what ended the manhunt. Not force, not confrontation, but recognition. But the case is not over. Because even with Joseph in custody, the most difficult questions remain unanswered. Questions that the arrest does not resolve. Questions that continue to haunt investigators. Why did it escalate this far? Why that night? Why the family? And why leave witnesses alive at all? Those answers would come later, in interrogation rooms, in trial testimony, in pieces that would take months to fully connect. But in that moment, one thing is certain. The search is over. The silence is broken. And the truth is now locked inside a system that will finally force it out. By the time Joseph Castana is brought back into custody, the case has already moved past urgency. It has moved into resolution, at least on paper. The manhunt is over. The location is confirmed. The evidence is secured. and investigators inside Aurora are finally face-to-face with the person they've been chasing through weeks of fragmented sightings, panic-driven movements, and unanswered questions. But what they're expecting is not what they get. The interrogation room. The atmosphere is controlled, almost clinical. A table, 2 chairs, recording equipment, files lay out in front of investigators that represent weeks of trauma, evidence, and reconstruction. Across from them sits Joseph. No dramatic posture, no visible emotion, no attempt to engage. He is physically present, but psychologically distant. The first questions are simple, direct, necessary. What happened that night? Why were you inside the house? How did you gain access? Silence. No hesitation. Not confusion. Silence. Investigators try again. Different framing. Different approach. More context. More urgency. Still nothing. The weight of silence. In most cases, suspects talk, even minimally, even inconsistently, even defensively, but talk. Silence like this is rare, because silence is not neutral. It is a position, and in this room, it begins to feel like resistance without movement, not denial, no explanation, just refusal, no apology, no emotional collapse, no attempt to justify actions, no narrative, just the absence of response. Investigators press harder. They reference evidence. They describe timelines. They outline witness statements. They reconstruct the night piece by piece in front of him. Still nothing. And with each unanswered question, the atmosphere shifts, not toward clarity, but toward frustration, because clarity requires participation from both sides. And Joseph is not participating. The psychological breakdown, that never comes. In many violent cases, interrogations eventually lead to cracks. Emotion breaks through. Memory becomes inconsistent. Guilt emerges in fragments. Fear surfaces. But here, nothing fractures. There is no visible psychological release. No breakdown. No confession shaped by pressure or remorse. Only stillness. And that stillness forces investigators to confront an uncomfortable reality. They are not dealing with someone trying to explain what happened. They are dealing with someone refusing the premise that explanation is required. What silence actually means here. Silence does not equal innocence, but it also does not equal clarity. In cases like this, it often reflects something else entirely. Control, even in custody, even under surveillance, even without freedom. Because speaking would mean engaging with accountability, and accountability would mean confronting the full weight of what occurred inside that home, inside the lives of people like Jessica Serrano, who survived something that reshaped everything around her, inside a family structure that was permanently altered in minutes, inside a community that still struggles to reconcile how quickly safety disappeared. But Joseph does not enter that space, not verbally, not emotionally, not psychologically. He stays outside of it. Even while sitting inside it, investigators left with evidence, not explanation. At this stage, law enforcement has what they need for prosecution: physical evidence, witness testimony, forensic confirmation, digital traces. But what they do not have is the most sought-after element in any violent case: motivation spoken in the suspect's own words. They can reconstruct events. They can prove actions. They can establish responsibility. But they cannot extract meaning from silence. And that absence becomes its own kind of weight in the room. Because every unanswered question becomes something the investigation has to carry forward without closure from the source. The final reality of the interrogation. Eventually, the session ends the way it began, with no confession, no explanation, no emotional resolution. Joseph is escorted out. The recording is saved. The file is closed. But nothing inside the room feels finished. Because even though the case is legally moving forward, the psychological gap remains untouched. Why did he do it? And why does he refuse to say? Those questions don't get answered in that room. They get pushed forward into something else entirely: trial, testimony, and public judgment. And in that space, silence stops being passive. It becomes part of the story itself. By 2024, the courtroom will no longer be just a legal setting. It is a final stage of a story that began in silence escalated in fear, and ended in irreversible loss. Inside the courthouse in Aurora, the air is different from everything that came before it. Controlled, formal, heavy in a way that no police report or investigation scene ever fully captured. Because now, everything that was once uncertain has to be defined in words that carry legal weight. At the center of it all is Joseph Castana. No longer a fugitive, no longer a moving target, just a defendant, seated, observed, judged. The evidence is no longer questioned. Prosecutors lay out the case with precision, not emotion, not speculation, but structure, timeline reconstruction, forensic confirmation, digital records, witness testimony. Each piece locks into the next. The 911 call, the hidden belongings inside the house, the confirmed forced entry, the sequence of attacks, the survival of a single witness, the aftermath, and together, they form something the defense cannot meaningfully dismantle, a complete narrative of intent and action, the victim at the center of it all. While the courtroom focuses on legal definitions, the reality behind the case never stops existing. The loss of Jessica Serrano's family, her father, her sister's partner, and others connected to the household that night. The prosecution does not just present names. They present lives, routines, relationships, normal evenings that ended without warning. Because in cases like this, numbers are never enough. The court must understand what was taken, not just legally, but humanly. The defense strategy, absence of explanation. The defense has limited space to operate. The evidence is overwhelming. The timeline is consistent. The forensic findings align with witness accounts. So the strategy does not center on denial. It shifts instead toward interpretation, state of mind, pressure, possible emotional collapse, anything that could reframe intent. But there is a problem. The accused does not provide context. No testimony, no confession, no narrative to reinterpret. Silence, once again, becomes part of the case. But now it works against him, because in court, silence does not interrupt evidence. It only leaves it standing unchallenged. Witness testimony and emotional weight. The most powerful moments in the trial do not come from attorneys. They come from testimony, from descriptions of fear, from accounts of earlier incidents, from the reconstruction of a relationship marked by escalation and control. The courtroom hears how boundaries were crossed repeatedly, how concern turned into fear, how fear turned into preparation, and how preparation still failed to prevent what happened. The human reality of the case becomes unavoidable, not as a theory, but as a lived experience. The psychological picture the court builds, even without a statement from Joseph, the prosecution establishes a behavioral pattern: control, escalation, obsession, and the inability to accept separation. What emerges is not a single moment of violence, but a trajectory, one that builds over time and converges on a single night, a night where everything reached its breaking point. The verdict, after deliberation, the jury returns guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder. No hesitation in the reading, no ambiguity in the outcome. The legal system, at least at this moment, reaches total clarity. The sentence. The judge delivers the final ruling. For life sentences, no possibility of release, no reconsideration, no future legal pathway back into society. But the sentence is not just procedural. It is reflective, a response to the scale of harm presented in court. And then comes a moment that defines the emotional tone of the entire trial. The judge speaks directly about the nature of the crime, not in abstract terms, but in direct moral language. A man driven by control, a man who could not accept loss, a man who responded to rejection with destruction. And in that framing, the courtroom is reminded that legal outcomes and human understanding do not always align neatly. After the verdict, the case closes in court, but it does not close emotionally. Not for the survivor, not for the community, not for those who lived through the aftermath, because a verdict does not rebuild what was lost. It only defines accountability. And for Jessica Serrano, the outcome marks the end of one chapter, but not the end of recovery. Final reality. Joseph is no longer a fugitive, no longer a suspect, no longer a question mark in motion. He is a convicted offender serving life sentences. But even with judgment delivered, one absence remains. He still never explained why. And that silence continues to sit behind the case. Even after everything has been said, the courtroom is quiet now. The verdict has been delivered. The sentence has been read. And Joseph Castana is no longer part of the outside world. He is locked into a system designed to contain him for life. But containment is not the same as repair. Not even close. Outside the legal system, life does not reset. It continues. But it continues differently for those left behind. The survivor's reality. Jessica Serrano survived the night that ended everything else. She lived through what most people only process as headlines. But survival, in her case, is not a return to normal. It is the beginning of something heavier, because survival carries memory. And memory does not stay still. It replays. It interrupts. It lingers in places that feel safe, but are no longer safe in the same way. Jessica did not just lose people. She lost structure, the foundation of daily life that most people take for granted. A father's voice in the house, a sister's presence in the next room, children's noise in the background of ordinary evenings. All of it went in a single night that began like any other, the weight of what cannot be replaced. Her father, Jesus Serrano, is no longer part of her world. Neither is her sister, Mariana. Neither are the people who made the house feel full rather than empty. And grief in this form is not linear. It does not arrive once. It arrives in waves, triggered by silence, triggered by memory, triggered by ordinary moments that now feel altered forever. Even simple things, places in the home, sounds at night, routines that once felt meaningless, become reminders, not of what is present, but of what is permanently absent. The invisible injury, what happened inside that home, did not only cause physical loss. It reshaped perception. It changed how safety feels. It changed how trust functions. It changed how the world is interpreted in quiet moments. Because when violence enters a place that is supposed to be safe, it doesn't just destroy people. It disrupts the concept of safety itself. And that disruption does not stay inside one house. It follows the survivors everywhere. The hardest truth, in cases like this, people often search for a single explanation, a moment where everything could have gone differently, a decision that could have prevented it, a warning that should have been enough. But hindsight creates clarity that real time does not allow, and clarity after the fact does not change the outcome. The reality is that many of the warning signs were there. Escalation patterns, control behaviors, repeated boundary violations, fear that grew slowly over time. But warning signs are not always treated as certainty until they become irreversible. That is one of the most painful truths in cases involving coercive control and escalating violence. Not because people ignore danger deliberately, but because danger often builds gradually enough to be rationalized, until it can't be anymore. What the system could not undo. Even though the legal system reached its conclusion, life sentences, no release, final judgment, it operates in a different domain than emotional recovery. It answers questions of responsibility, not questions of restoration. It cannot return lost family members. It cannot restore moments that were interrupted. It cannot reverse the sequence of events that unfolded in minutes but changed a lifetime. What it can do is define accountability. And it did. But accountability and healing are not the same path. They rarely move at the same speed. Sometimes they never meet at all. The house that remembers. The home in Aurora no longer exists as it once did, not in function, not in feeling. Even if physically unchanged, it carries a different identity now. It is no longer just a family home. It is a site of memory, a place marked by absence. Where laughter once existed, there is now silence layered with history. Where routine once lived, there is now awareness of what was interrupted. Homes do not forget what happened inside them. Even when people try to move forward, the space holds on to what occurred there, what survival actually means. For Jessica, survival is not defined by escape. It is defined by continuation, learning to exist in a world where key parts of her life no longer exist. It is waking up and remembering again. It is rebuilding identity without the people who helped shape it. It is carrying forward while carrying a loss at the same time. And that is not something that resolves quickly. It is something that becomes part of life itself. The final reflection, the case of the Serrano family, does not end with the verdict. It ends with what remains after the verdict. A survivor, a convicted offender serving life. A family has been permanently changed. A community that learned how quickly stability can collapse. And a lesson that cannot be ignored. Violence rarely appears without history. Control rarely starts at its worst point. And warning signs, even when present, are not always understood in time to prevent tragedy. Closing reality. Justice was delivered. But justice does not restore what was lost. It only closes a legal chapter. What remains is everything that cannot be sentenced. Memory, absence, and the long process of learning how to live with both. Cases like this rarely begin the way they end. There is no explosion at the start. No obvious warning that everyone recognizes in real time. No clear signal that says this is where everything changes. Instead, they begin quietly, almost invisibly. They begin with a tension that feels like affection, with jealousy that gets explained away as love, with messages that arrive too often and then become expected, with questions that feel small at first, about where you are, who you're with, when you'll be back. And slowly, without most people noticing, those questions become expectations. And expectations become rules. And rules become control. In the case of Joseph Castana and Jessica Serrano, what eventually became irreversible did not appear overnight. It developed in stages. Each one is easier to dismiss than the last. Each one was more dangerous than it looked in isolation. The pattern most people miss. What makes cases like this so difficult to fully grasp is not just the violence at the end. It is the predictability of the pattern before it. Because from the outside, escalation often looks like inconsistency. Moments of calm between moments of conflict. Apologies after harm. Promises after fear. Emotional intensity that gets mistaken for attachment. And when something is intermittent, it becomes easier to tolerate, easier to explain, easier to delay acting on. But in reality, what looks like inconsistency is often progression, a slow tightening of control that becomes harder to recognize the deeper you are inside it, when control replaces connection. At the center of this type of case is not just anger, it is possession, a belief that another person is not fully separate, that their independence is temporary, that separation is not an ending, it is a problem to be solved. And when that belief takes hold, boundaries stop being respected. They become obstacles. Obstacles that some people begin to believe they are entitled to remove. That is where danger begins to shift from emotional to physical. Not instantly, but inevitably. The quiet reality behind loud tragedies. By the time violence becomes visible, the earlier stages are already buried under normal life. Work continues. Families adapt. Explanations are made. Red flags are rationalized. Because life does not pause for escalation. It accommodates it until it can't anymore. And when the breaking point finally arrives, it often feels sudden to those watching from the outside, even though, for those inside it, the pattern has been building for a long time. The hard question that remains, after cases like this are documented, investigated, and prosecuted, one question does not disappear. What could change the outcome? But that question, while natural, is incomplete on its own, because it assumes a single moment of failure, when in reality, it is usually a series of missed opportunities, misread signals, and delayed responses to patterns that were not yet fully understood. And that is what makes these cases so unsettling. Not just what happened, but how long had it been developing before it became visible. The broader reflection. The Serrano case is not an isolated story. It reflects a broader reality that exists in many communities. Violence tied to control does not announce itself loudly. It builds quietly in relationships, homes, and routines that appear ordinary from the outside. And that is what makes it difficult to interrupt early, because early stages do not look like emergencies. They look like relationships, complicated ones, emotional ones, sometimes even loving ones. until they are not. The question that lingers, even after arrests, even after trials, even after sentences that last a lifetime, one question remains unanswered in a way that matters beyond the courtroom. How many situations like this are still unfolding right now, silently, behind closed doors, in places where nothing looks wrong yet, not dramatic, not visible, not yet irreversible? And more importantly, how many of them will only be recognized when it is already too late? That is the part of these stories that lingers long after the case is closed. Not just what happened, but what might still be happening elsewhere. And that is where the real unease begins. Because the most dangerous cases are rarely the ones that look dangerous at the start. They are the ones that look ordinary until they don't. If this story stayed with you, that's because it should. These aren't just cases. They're real lives, real families, and real warnings. Subscribe now for more chilling true crime stories that go beyond the headlines and uncover what really happened. Because sometimes the most dangerous person is the one already inside.